Hi, I'm Alex from the Zscaler Customer Success Engineering team. In this series of short videos, we're taking a look at the baseline recommendations for the inspection of TLS encrypted web traffic. This is part 4 of 5, the recommended policy model for SSL inspection. This slide shows the model policy for SSL inspection. This is broadly speaking what a policy based on best practices should look like. Let me walk you through it from top to bottom. Before I do this, it's important to understand how policy rules are evaluated by Zscaler. Of note, rules are evaluated from top to bottom, starting with rule number 1 all the way to the final rule. If a rule matches, that is, traffic meets the criteria of a rule, then that rule will be applied to that traffic, and no further rule will be evaluated. With that in mind, let's take a look at the rules. Number 1 is the Zscaler recommended exemption rule. This is a rule that bypasses select destinations, both Zscaler's own and third-party vendor destinations, which are necessary for the functioning of Zscaler's own services. For example, this includes destinations that are required for the Zscaler client connected to update itself, as well as destinations for third-party vendors which Zscaler partners closely with, such as CrowdStrike or Microsoft. This rule should be left at the top of the list and not be disabled. Rules number 3 and 4 are the one-click rules, such as the Office 365 one-click rule, or the various UCAS one-click rules, like the Zoom one-click rule or WebEx one-click rule. These rules include a list of destinations given directly to Zscaler by the vendors for those respective applications, which they have told us cannot be inspected, and as such will exempt those destinations entirely from SSL inspection, as well as cloud app control and URL control. This is why we have rule number 2 in this list. If you wish to inspect OneDrive or SharePoint to protect your users from potential malware hosted on the services, or you wish to perform tenant restriction for Office 365 services, you will need to inspect OneDrive, SharePoint, and Microsoft Login services respectively. If you wish to do this, which we do strongly recommend, you'll need to create a rule above the Office 365 one-click rule to make sure that it is applied first, since, as discussed, rules are evaluated one by one, and the first match rule will stop evaluation for subsequent rules. To do this, you would create an inspect rule that targets the OneDrive, SharePoint, and Microsoft Login Services cloud applications for the location group corporate user traffic and the device groups Windows or Mac users. This will ensure that users on guest Wi-Fi locations don't have their Office 365 or Microsoft Login Services inspected. Below the Office 365 and other one-click rules, this is where you'll exempt any traffic you don't wish to inspect for your own destinations. This is generally broken down into 3 types of rules. At the top, in position 5+, we'll have global destination-based exemptions. Global meaning they apply to all users, and destination-based meaning they are based on where the traffic is going, i.e. URLs and URL categories. Examples of this sort of rule would include global bypass lists, where you put traffic that must be bypassed for all users, since it corresponds to applications or services that all users inside the company use. Another example of this type of rule would be rules that allow a lower TLS version, or allow undecryptable traffic, or untrusted service certificates for specific destinations that require those restrictions to be relaxed. Below these rules, we'll find global source-based exemption. Global, again, meaning they apply to all users. Source-based, meaning that this is based on where the traffic is coming from, rather than where the traffic is going to. An example of this sort of rule would be global rules to bypass all traffic from specific IoT and guest Wi-Fi locations, since the devices on those locations will be unmanaged or do not have certificate stores, so they cannot receive the SSL certificate, which means that you will not be able to inspect the traffic, because that would simply break the internet for those devices. Finally, below these global source-based exemptions, we have any rule that is more specific, i.e. not global, i.e. does not apply to all users. These rules are granular by source and destination, with whatever criteria combination you wish. A good example of this sort of rule is a bypass rule that exempts the Apple Store and other Apple CDNs from inspection for users on iOS and Mac devices. Because these destinations do certificate pinning, if this traffic is not exempted, users on those devices will not be able to fetch OS updates or application updates. But because this is only the case for macOS and iOS users, there's no need to exempt these destinations for all corporate users, so it's better to create a specific rule that exempts these destinations only for iOS users. This logic is what you want to apply to all bypasses. You should be creating specific rules to make sure that as little traffic as possible is bypassed for as few users as possible, wherever possible. One important thing to note is that the one-click rules are set to bypass other policies per the recommendations of their respective vendors. What this means is that traffic that matches the one-click rules will be excluded from both the Cloud App Control and URL Control modules as well as SSL Inspection. To prevent this from happening to traffic that you want to exempt only from SSL Inspection, you should make sure that your custom bypass rules are set to evaluate other policies, not bypass other policies. By setting them to evaluate other policies, you will also be able to configure various settings, such as blocking untrusted service certificates or enforcing a minimum TLS version. Finally, at the bottom of this list, we have our inspect all rule. The purpose of this rule is to ensure that any traffic that does not explicitly match an exclusion you've configured is inspected. That way, whenever you start sending new traffic from new destinations, new users, etc., this will make sure that that traffic is inspected and not accidentally bypassed from SSL inspection, ensuring that you have good security coverage and you minimize your risk. That's it for this video. In the next and final video, we'll talk about operational best practices for the management of your SSL bypass list.